In the autumn of 1879, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory, a farmer stood inside a dark wooden barn, holding a lantern in one hand and a leather journal in the other. Outside, the first frost of October crept across the fields. Inside, hidden beneath the smell of hay, wet soil, and cattle feed, sat something the official history of America insists never existed. It was more than 12 feet tall. The farmer's name was Eliar Rena, a Pennsylvania Dutch settler who had spent years carving a modest life from the wilderness along the Bitterroot River. His neighbors believed he was quiet, practical, deeply religious. Nobody imagined that for nearly 6 months, Rena had been feeding and hiding a living giant behind locked barn doors, while cavalry patrols moved silently across the Montana frontier, searching for something they never intended the public to see. According to the journal, later discovered inside the walls of the original farmhouse, the being called itself Avik. It spoke fluent English. It described buried cities beneath the American soil, towers swallowed by mud, roads older than the railroads, and survivors hunted for decades after what it called the burying. Then, on the morning of October 9th, armed soldiers arrived carrying sealed orders from Washington. The barn was surrounded before sunrise. The journals were confiscated. The giant was loaded into a reinforced wagon under armed guard. And within weeks, Eliar Rena was declared insane. For more than a century, the story disappeared into silence, hidden behind missing records, redacted military files, and a forgotten grave outside Helena. But when a second journal surfaced in 1971, investigators discovered something unsettling. The farmer had written everything down, every conversation, every warning, every impossible detail the giant told him before the army came. And the most disturbing part was not the giant itself. It was the claim that America had been built over the ruins of something far older, something deliberately erased from memory. To understand why the army would travel into an isolated Montana valley to capture a wounded giant, you first have to understand what the American frontier actually looked like during the middle of the 19th century. The version taught in schools describes an empty wilderness, a vast untouched land waiting for settlers, railroads, and civilization. But the newspapers, mining journals, and local reports from that period describe something very different. Across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakota Territories, settlers repeatedly discovered strange remnants that did not fit the official timeline. Railroad crews uncovered enormous stone foundations buried beneath layers of compacted soil. Prospectors reported roads made from a material harder than granite disappearing directly into mountain passes where no documented settlements had ever existed. Wells appeared in places no active mining operation had reached, carved with such precision that even experienced engineers questioned who had built them. And then there were the bones, the Helena Independent, the Bozeman Avant Courier, and the Deer Lodge New Northwest all carried reports describing skeletons measuring 9, 10, sometimes even 14 feet in length. These were not whispered campfire stories. Doctors examined them. Sheriffs documented them. Military personnel occasionally appeared at excavation sites within days, sometimes within hours, removing the remains before researchers or newspaper illustrators could study them properly. By the autumn of 1879, stories of giant bones had become common enough across the Northwest that when Eliar Rena later claimed to have sheltered a living giant inside his barn, many people did not immediately dismiss it as madness. What terrified them was not the possibility that giants had once existed. It was the possibility that one still lived. Rena himself was not considered unstable. He was 46 years old, disciplined, methodical, and known throughout the Bitterroot Valley as a hard-working farmer. After losing his first wife to scarlet fever back in 1864, he traveled west seeking isolation and a new beginning. 3 years later, he remarried a widow named Martha Voss and settled onto roughly 60 acres beside the Bitterroot River. Their farm stood far from neighboring properties, almost a full day's ride from Stevensville, surrounded by forest, pasture land, and steep mountain ridges. That isolation became critical on the morning of April 17th. A storm had rolled down from the mountains for nearly 2 straight days, turning the upper pasture into deep black mud. Before dawn, Rena rode out to check his sheep and noticed what he first believed was a fallen tree lying half submerged near the edge of the slope. But as he approached through the rain, he realized the shape was breathing. The figure was enormous. Its skin resembled weathered parchment stretched across massive limbs. Its fingers were longer than a grown man's forearm. A deep wound cut into the left thigh, sealed with a dark resin-like substance instead of blood. Rena later wrote that the eyes disturbed him most of all. Pale gray, almost silver, watching him with complete awareness. For nearly 20 minutes, neither moved. Then the giant slowly lifted one hand, palm upward. It was asking for help. Rena returned to the farmhouse without speaking a word to Marta. He gathered 2 wool blankets, a length of rope, a wooden sled, and his old draft horse, Gus. The climb back into the upper pasture took hours through rain and mud, and by the time the giant was finally dragged into the barn, darkness had already swallowed the valley. Up close, the wound looked even stranger. The opening in the thigh was nearly the width of a dinner plate, crusted with a black substance that resembled hardened tree resin more than human blood. Rena cleaned it using carbolic acid and strips torn from old bed sheets. Throughout the process, the giant never cried out. It simply watched him work with an expression Rena later described as tired beyond comprehension. When the bandaging was complete, the giant finally spoke. The voice sounded low and deliberate, like stones grinding beneath deep water. "Thank you," it said. "I have been walking for a long time." The being identified itself as Arvik. For the next 6 months, Eliar Rena lived a double life. During the day, he tended livestock, repaired fences, and worked the fields beside his family as though nothing had changed. At night, after the lanterns inside the farmhouse had gone dark, he carried food into the barn and sat beside the giant with a notebook resting on his knee. Arvik ate bread, beef, root vegetables, and enormous quantities of well water. Slowly the wound healed. Slowly the conversations deepened. Often, according to the hidden journal discovered nearly a century later, Arvik claimed the world known to Americans in 1879 was not ancient at all, but recent, assembled from the ruins of something deliberately forgotten. Long before railroads crossed the continent, long before frontier forts or territorial governments existed, there had already been cities across North America, not primitive settlements, cities. Arvik described towering stone structures polished smooth as glass, massive plazas, underground chambers, fountains operating without pumps, and streets illuminated without flame. The inhabitants, according to him, were taller than modern men, many reaching 8 or 10 feet in height, though only a smaller number possessed the immense stature associated with giants. Then came what Arvik called the burying, a flood unlike any ordinary disaster. Not water alone, but waves of thick mud rising high enough to swallow entire lower stories of buildings. Some towns vanished completely beneath the earth. Others survived only as fragments, their upper levels protruding above packed layers of hardened sediment. Afterward, survivors scattered into mountains, cave systems, abandoned tunnels, and forests while organized hunts began across the continent. At first, Rena refused to believe him, so Arvik offered proof. He described a location hidden within the nearby foothills where an old doorway remained trapped beneath roughly 15 feet of soil. The next morning, Rena rode out carrying a shovel and spent hours digging through dense packed earth until iron struck stone. Beneath the soil lay the curved top of a massive carved arch. The symbols etched across it matched no language he had ever seen. Rena covered the structure again before returning home, shaken so badly he could barely hold the reins. From that moment forward, he no longer doubted Arvik's story. And once belief entered the barn, the giant began revealing something even more dangerous. The army already knew. According to Arvik, the United States Army had spent decades quietly tracking giants across the Western Territories. Whenever unusual skeletons surfaced during railroad excavations, mining operations, or ranch expansion, soldiers often arrived before independent researchers could properly examine the remains. Newspapers might print brief reports, sometimes even sketches or sworn testimony from local officials, but the bones themselves almost always disappeared soon afterward. Arvik insisted this was not random, it was organized policy. He claimed military detachments had been collecting both dead and living survivors for more than 30 years, transporting them east under sealed authority, while official records were altered, sealed, or erased entirely. The giant explained that many of his kind had already vanished by the time Eliar Rena found him in the mountains. For nearly 2 years, Arvik had traveled only after sunset, hiding during daylight inside abandoned mines and cave systems stretching through the northern Rockies. He describes surviving attacks from hunting parties, logging crews, and armed patrols, moving through the wilderness under orders they barely understood themselves. The injury in his thigh came while crossing a river near the Mission Mountains after dogs from a logging camp caught his scent and forced him into the water before he escaped into the forest. One evening, Rena finally asked the question he had avoided since April. "What happens if they find you?" Arvik answered immediately, "They will kill me, or they will take me somewhere. I will wish they had." By late September, the wound had nearly closed. Arvik could stand upright again, though movement remained painful. He informed Rena that he intended to leave during the next new moon in October and travel south toward the Wind River Range, where he believed 2 additional survivors still hid within a cave network known only to their people. Rena agreed to help him escape. He prepared dried meat, heavy blankets, hard biscuits, and a massive coat stitched together from buffalo hide. He even carved a walking staff from ironwood strong enough to support the giant's weight during the journey toward the Idaho border. None of it mattered. Before sunrise on October 9th, a column of cavalry rode onto the property. There were 22 soldiers in total, led by a captain named Holcomb, carrying sealed documents issued from Washington. They bypassed the farmhouse entirely and surrounded the barn first, as though they already knew exactly what waited inside. Marta screamed when armed men flooded the yard. The children hid in the cellar. Mary Two Rivers fled into the woods and disappeared for several days. Meanwhile, Captain Holcomb ordered Rena to unlock the barn. He refused. 2 soldiers shattered the lock using an axe. Arvik sat calmly against the far wall beneath drifting beams of dusty morning light, the buffalo hide coat draped across his shoulders. He did not resist arrest. He simply looked toward Rena and nodded once, as though both men already understood the outcome. The soldiers had arrived prepared. Outside waited a reinforced wagon fitted with iron grating along the sides. Nearly 8 men struggled to move the giant inside. Captain Holcomb informed Rena he was being detained for harboring a fugitive against the authority of the United States government. No formal charges were ever filed. The journals were confiscated immediately, and by sunset both the farmer and the giant had vanished from the valley. Eliar Rena never returned home as a free man. After spending 2 weeks inside an army stockade outside Helena, he was transferred to the Montana Territorial Asylum under the recommendation of a military physician who diagnosed him with what officials called frontier dementia. No public hearing took place. No criminal trial was recorded. 4 years later, at only 50 years old, Rena died in his sleep and was buried in an unmarked grave outside Helena. For decades, the story disappeared. The original journal kept inside the barn vanished into military custody and was never returned to the family. Marta Voss Rena rarely discussed the incident again, and neighbors gradually treated the entire event as another strange frontier rumor swallowed by time. But almost a century later, something unexpected surfaced inside the walls of the old farmhouse. In 1971, a descendant named Carl Voss Rena began renovating the upstairs bedroom of the original property. While removing damaged plaster, he uncovered a small leather-bound journal hidden inside a tin tobacco box wedged between the wall studs. It was Eliar Rena's secondary notebook, secretly maintained alongside the confiscated original in case soldiers ever came searching. Inside were direct transcripts of conversations with Arvik, not summaries, not paraphrased memories, pages of detailed dialogue written night after night beneath lantern light inside the barn. Most disturbing of all was the final conversation recorded on the evening before the cavalry arrived. According to the journal, Arvik already knew the soldiers were approaching long before they reached the valley. Somehow, from miles away, he sensed them moving through the mountains. He warned Rena not to fight, not to lie, not to sacrifice his life for a stranger. Then came the final statement. "Your people will be told we were never here. They will be told the bones belong to animals. They will be told the buried cities are accidents of geology. They will believe this for 150 years. But soil remembers better than men." Arvik then instructed him to watch the rivers during dry summers, to pay attention whenever floodwaters cut through the earth, whenever excavation crews dug deeper than expected, whenever old foundations appeared beneath modern streets. The final sentence in the journal was written by Rena himself only hours before the cavalry arrived. He said, "The truth does not die. It only waits. What happened to Arvik afterward remains unknown. Military records from Montana Territory during that period are heavily redacted, while several transportation logs connected to eastern rail routes appear incomplete or entirely missing. Researchers tracing the cavalry route believe the wagon eventually reached the railhead at Bismarck in Dakota Territory, where prisoners and cargo could be moved quietly across the country. Some investigators suspect Arvik was transferred into Smithsonian custody alongside giant skeletons reportedly catalogued during the late 19th century before disappearing into restricted storage. Others believe he was moved to a military facility in Maryland that no longer officially exists on modern records. Meanwhile, independent paper and ink analysts examining the second journal concluded the materials matched the late 19th century exactly. Photographs of selected pages continue circulating among researchers studying buried civilizations, missing architecture, and old-world anomalies across America. The full journal, however, has never been publicly released. What makes the story of Eliar Rena so unsettling is not simply the existence of a giant hidden inside a Montana barn. Frontier America was already filled with reports of enormous skeletons, buried foundations, impossible stonework, and towns uncovering remnants nobody could properly explain. The deeper question is why so many of those discoveries vanished almost immediately after officials became involved. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Bones are photographed, then removed. Excavations are reported, then sealed. Records exist briefly, then disappear into missing archives, redacted files, or private collections nobody is permitted to examine. And beneath all of it sits the same uncomfortable possibility that the version of history taught for generations may describe only the surface layer of a much older story, buried underneath the American landscape itself. Arvik claimed the soil remembers better than men. Strangely, history keeps producing moments that seem to echo that warning. Rivers expose strange stonework after droughts. Construction crews uncover tunnels beneath cities that official maps never recorded. Floods tear away layers of earth and reveal foundations already standing long before modern development supposedly began. Maybe these are isolated coincidences, or maybe they are fragments of something larger, struggling to return to the surface. Eliar Rena died believing the truth would emerge during the lifetime of his descendants. Nearly a century later, his hidden journal finally resurfaced from inside the walls of the farmhouse where he concealed it before the army arrived. One forgotten book, one farmer, one giant carried away under armed guard, and one final warning that still lingers beneath the official story of America. If the giants never existed, then why did so much effort go into making sure nothing remained behind except silence?